One of the things that's really cool about being an engineering major at this age is that I have already lived some life and have cultivated quite other interests throughout most of my life, including uh, learning a lot about religion, both my own religion, Christianity, and other religions. And, I've always been more of a spiritual minded person than a scientific minded person for the most part. However, that is not a reality because there isn't really a dichotomy between what is spiritual and what is physical. The whole idea that there is a dichotomy is an illusion itself and is really challenged in Eastern philosophy in a glaringly obvious way. But it's also um, true in Western religion as well, only it's more in the hidden side of the way you look at things. And I am super excited about growing this new way of understanding as like not a opposition to the way that I've always thought, but as here's another button on the machine. Here's another great tool. And what is the machine that I'm talking about? The machine that I'm talking about would be the self-organizing intelligence of nature. It would be that very impulse which gives diversity to life and causes evolution to always be reaching for the betterment of the species. It's that like spark of sentience that's hinted at in the way that it operates on a day-to-day basis. And when you go into classical mechanics, which I'm studying right now, I'm in a very early part of my physics education, and I have a long way to go. But I'm thinking about how all these equations, that we are given have actual, visible, tangible meaning in the real world all around us all the time. And there's not a single instance where they don't. They rule everything. They rule the brain chemistry, the thoughts that give rise to the language we're speaking to communicate about this right now, you know, as one tiny example. When you go into modern physics, which I'm not actually formally studying right now, but I know like the pop culture amount of it, from cool documentaries I've watched and just talking to other people. And like modern physics is this whole departure, and it's a way of realizing that we are only at the tip of what we need to learn in order to have like another picture again that matches the way that we thought we understood the world before modern physics came along. If you're following that, then what I'm trying to say really is that it's an exciting time to be alive. And the things that are being discovered, such as, all of these tiny little pieces of matter that we didn't even dream of before and the way that they interact. And if you think about integration, which I'm learning, integration is a way of describing a shape of a very particular graph and the spaces in between it, which can be filled in to make any other kind of shape. I mean, there's an integral which is the shape of a butterfly. There's an integral which could be the shape of anything, a wedding band, even if it had like really fancy ridges and curves on it. The bottom line is you can do everything with these two buttons really of physics and mathematics, and they're kind of like the two places on the great machine we've reached out and we've been like, there's a button, and every time there's been a discovery of something like the Cartesian coordinate system or the unit circle, these are just basic things. The periodic table of the elements, all these things are discoveries. They just, they work out on paper. When you do math, you start from an abstract concept and it starts to demonstrate all these real things that happen in the world. That's magic. That is magic. It's using symbols to describe it and also to create it, to design everything around us. And we have these two little buttons, really. Religion, on the other hand, is also a way of interacting with the machine, but it's a living machine. So when we think about it from the religion point of view, it seems disrespectful to call it a machine. But that's not even what we mean, because what we mean is all these interlocking parts, which all of mankind's machinery really is just trying to imitate what nature has done. And yet we are also nature. We are also a part of nature. We are nature expressing itself to the same extent that everything else is. And for that very point alone, it's the self-organizing intelligence. So all these things getting discovered, it means that there's room for a greater cooperation of mankind with nature. We can learn so much more. Think about the applications that have already been put to use. We can discover something like a mushroom that eats plastic, and we can look at its genome, and we could edit it. And there's a whole bunch of morality questions, debates around that, isn't there? And I pay attention to those too. But there's also the point being made, and I agree, that we have always messed around with nature as human beings. From the time we domesticated the dog, probably before that, certainly all of agriculture to begin with was a great innovation in the mind of man. And the pace of that is quickening up, of course, and we're having a bigger and a bigger and a bigger impact. And that is scary, and that's why the debates are being had, and why they need to continue to be had. But I also believe that the way that we are impacting nature now is itself, the impulse to do it is not wrong. And as human beings, I feel like we've learned a lot, and we're really bad at a lot of things. And so the fact that we have learned a lot does not entitle us. But being that as we live on this planet, we are going to operate as a species, as a whole, in ways that individuals may not approve of and may not have much control over. Think about how much you might want to change a particular policy of your state or your nation. Wanting it doesn't make it happen. And we are going to have an impact on the planet, whether we like it or not. So studying to make that impact helpful rather than harmful. It's not about limiting yourself to different methods. It's about finding the responsible way and the most efficient way, and the way that works with nature in every case. And sometimes working with nature can mean introducing something like a plastic eating mushroom into an environment where there's a lot of trash that needs to be cleaned up. And if you could put that mushroom, which grows on land, in the ocean somehow, and make it adapt to survive in the ocean and devour all that plastic, that would take some intelligence. That would take some really learned biotechnology, engineering, and experimentation. But it could be done in theory, and how awesome would that be? There are so many different possibilities, and there's so many challenges that the world actually does need to focus on right now. That's one tiny little application right there, which could be looked at through the lens of biology, technology, and engineering. And engineering can link up with the chemistry science, with physics science, and with biology. All the branches, it can work with all of them at the same time. In the same way that you work in 3 dimensions, you can approach the same problem from 3 or more disciplines and come to a collaborative solution on many problems that the world has. I want to see all that happen. I want to be some small piece of it. And I think that being a spiritually minded person for my life, you know, up until now and continuing to be now, but also taking on the lens of science, I think that since we know these are just separate buttons on the machine, and you touch one button, and it might seem like it's doing something really unexpected given what you know about this button over here. And that's where a lot of the dichotomy takes place between religion and science. People naturally assume that since this button works over here that I'm familiar with, that button over there is not actually the one that's programmed right. But maybe it is. Maybe it's just that the machine is a lot bigger and more complex than you think. And you're like a kid just punching around on command keys. You have no idea what you're doing to the computer. But if one could learn those connections a little bit more closely, if we could find another button or two to add in, another tool to use, whether scientific or spiritual or somewhere in the region between them both, there is a way to discover something of real importance and value. And maybe each person's intuition who comes into that field gets a shot at that, gets a crack at that. If so, my intuition, relying on the more spiritual side, may have some interesting application.